We're kind of in a new, interesting era for anti Nintendo narratives because we are at the cusp of a new generation of great Zelda games, right? Headed by a completely different group of people than we have for the past 30 years, right? Aonuma has acknowledged that he is getting older and that retirement is on the horizon. Miyamoto's on the way out. Lots of these old guard guys are retiring, right? But these are the guys that people have been like trying for decades to write off, to ignore, to try and pretend as if they aren't actually all that great game developers, right? You have the Crash Bandicoot guy giving interviews about how Mario Sunshine was disappointing because it wasn't cinematic enough, and how Miyamoto was losing his touch. Meanwhile, 20 years later, Miyamoto has this very successful brand, with Mario, with a movie, right? Multiple spin-off titles, hugely successful spin-off mainline games. New Super Mario Bros. Wonder is probably going to sell 30 million units, right? And meanwhile, Crash Bandicoot can't even get like its ridiculous live service 3D battle royale game going. Like it's DOA, right? Dead on arrival, right? You have that guy. You have like the hate towards like Aonuma in particular, right? The guy behind 3D Zelda for the past 30 years, right? Worked on Ocarina of Time, was promoted to like series producer. By the time Wind Waker came out, and has been overseeing the direction of the series ever since. Aonuma in particular is an example of someone who I think was unfairly treated by the industry, like from the get-go, right? Because like when Wind Waker came out, like people blamed him for that. When Twilight Princess, Phantom Hourglass, like, oh man, Zelda's going downhill, Nintendo's going bankrupt. Oh, Zelda used to be the best in gaming, but now it's a shell of its former self. Like it was a narrative that took hold very early on into his tenure, and he was never really able to shake it off, even as like Zelda games became better than what they were previously. And by the time Breath of the Wild came out, they were putting out some of the best Zelda games ever, right? And it was entirely under Aonuma's watch. And right now, we're not seeing a lot of people give him credit for that. If anything, I feel like the Aonuma hate is getting stronger than ever, right? Like it's so weird, like seeing people like Sean Malmstrom try and come out and say that there's like some elaborate conspiracy to like get rid of Link's sword, like to emasculate him or whatever, right? Like that Aonuma is obsessed with puzzles, right? Like it's 2023. We've gotten like 2 open air Zeldas. We've gotten 2 like Breath of the Wild games, and like the puzzle thing. Like I love puzzles in the original Zelda game, but like this idea that somehow that like Aonuma is so obsessed with puzzles that it like diminishes the core experience is blatantly not true, especially in the newer Zelda games. We're at the point now where it is really impossible for me to like take the complaints regarding modern Zelda seriously, because it used to feel like, yeah, okay, newer Zelda games, they're not like the old ones, they're different. Maybe some people prefer them. Whatever, right? I don't agree with that, but like I understand why someone might feel that way. I myself thought, Zelda peaked at like A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening and Ocarina for like the longest time until like Skyward Sword and A Link Between Worlds came out, right? I felt that way. I didn't agree that the newer games were bad, but I understood what people were talking about when they were talking about how like Zelda was rehashed and how they weren't innovating enough and how like they were too samey. Like I could understand what people we're talking about. Like I felt there was some basis in reality as to what they were saying, but like now that like we're in this period where like the old narrative no longer applies, right? Like we've completely flipped the script with a lot of these IPs, right? 3D Mario, 3D Zelda, Metroid. A lot of these games have gone back to their roots in a lot of ways, have like completely innovated in others. And you're seeing the same group of people whine and complain for absolutely no reason, right? I think, again, I think like the pivot away from like trying to, the attempts at like downplaying Breath of the Wild, I think, are the most blatant example of this, where the same people who spent like 20 years trying to tell you that like Zelda was too easy, that it was rehashed, that it didn't do this, that like Skyrim was better because it was open world, like the same people tried to do a 180 and say that like Breath of the Wild wasn't a good open world game when that came out, right? They were trying to like make up something They were trying to come up with some kind of excuse, some kind of justification to downplay the game, and they never really settled on a narrative, right? Like everything they tried just fell flat on its face. Like, oh, Horizon Zero Dawn is better. What's Horizon Zero Dawn? They tried saying the open world was empty, demonstrably not true. They tried, complaining about the story, like the visuals, the combat, railing on the combat is a common thing right now. They're trying to do the same thing they've always done, but, the issue is because, there's no pattern anymore, right? Now that they have to dismiss completely different kinds of Zelda games at once, it's become this narrative where they can't settle on a narrative, right? If Zelda has been bad since A Link to the Past, why are the games still popular? Why was there this big burst of popularity with Breath of the Wild? Why do people still go back and play games like Skyward Sword or Ocarina or Wind Waker and consider those classics if they weren't good at all, right? It's getting to the point where I straight up have no respect for people who criticize Zelda in any capacity because, I've seen this happen for years now where it's just constantly trying to make excuses to downplay the big Nintendo series, right? That's all this is. That's all it comes down to is just people who hate Nintendo are trying to find reasons to complain about, the executives, the creators, and the games themselves, right? And you're going to see a lot of these people continue doing this, long after Aonuma is gone, long after, Nintendo, the series pivots into something else. It's always going to be, this perpetual thing, it feels where certain people are going to obsessively pretend that new Nintendo games are bad, but the old ones are good, right? And I don't know how much longer this can continue, especially these days. I think a big reason why it took off so much in the 2000s in particular was because of game journalism was the only outlet for gaming news. So people took them very seriously when they tried to say that Kid Icarus Uprising had broken controls, or that they didn't cover Conker's Bad Fur Day much, or Halo overshadowed Perfect Dark and stuff like that. There were all these incidents that were promoted by the gaming media, and now that they're no longer relevant, now that people are more actively talking amongst themselves and coming to their own decisions, I think more and more that it's going to be difficult to write off even the most obscure Nintendo games, right? I'm seeing game journalists like Jason Schreier coming out and speaking out against Master Detective Operation Raincoat for being too sexy. Who in their right mind is going to find that a problem? Who cares really? I feel very strongly about that, and this is probably one of the most interesting, unique new IPs for Switch this year. Not from Nintendo, from a third party, and we're already seeing people the game journalists try and strike out against it, try and do something to downplay this game, try to find something they can complain about. And, this happened to Bayonetta 3, this happened to No More Heroes 3. It's not just Nintendo games that are getting, flack anymore. It's, any major studio that puts out any kind of, bitch budget game that's going to have, a dedicated cult following, that is, has to be dealt with from these people because they cannot allow you to enjoy your Nintendo games. That's what it comes down to, really. And I feel as if this is a mindset that really needs to be pushed back against, right? I'm tired of having to defend every single game that comes out, right? It hasn't been as bad in recent years, but why exactly am I still trying to convince people that the Switch 2 isn't going to happen soon? Why exactly do I have to talk about how every Nintendo game is good and talk about every major controversy? It should be something that's taken for granted that if someone speaks out against Zelda, they're just a fanboy for some other company or for some other game trying to downplay, the greatest fantasy series of all time, right? We've been seeing this over and over again. Why exactly do we listen to anybody who criticizes Nintendo?